Well, a great honor for me to be here. Thank you so much. And thanks very much to the organizers and the director and other people's here from the One Buddhist Center, Retreat Center. I think in Korea, I was told the Korean government officially recognizes and patronizes four spiritual traditions. Chogye, which is Zen Buddhism. Wan, which is a kind of you could say a modern, a more universal form of the Zen tradition. Then Catholics and Protestant. So I myself grew up as an Irish Protestant in French Canada. But we got along well with the Catholics, in spite of all of their bad habits. And from age 5 or 6 or 7, I started hearing about other spiritual traditions. And in my early teens, I encountered a image of a Buddha, and immediately sort of my socks fell off and my hair stood on end. Some sort of ancient, distant, karmic connection, karmic seed stirred from within me. My mom was a theosophist, which was one of those traditions very popular about 100 years ago in urban Europe and America that looked to all traditions and the truth in all traditions. So she had many books from India, China, Japan, Korea, other Persia, and so forth. So as a teenager, I had the good fortune to peruse things like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, the Dharmapada, the Way of the Sufi, and other such traditions. But I think Mom always claimed that on her side of the family we were descended from Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote the Shakespeare plays. And so I think that gave me a sort of a stronger interest in the literary, well, I'll put it this way, the literary aspects of traditions became important to me, or seemed important to me. So I very much fell in love with the Buddhist literature, the way in which the spiritual situation is described, and also in which the human, the process of human development is articulated. That language especially appealed to me. And as a result, I sort of went more into that side of the literature, that side of the world traditions. And some years later, I learned the Dalai Lama opened a school for Western people in Dharamshala. He was living as a refugee there following the Chinese communist takeover of Tibet. So I saved my shekels and traveled to Dharamshala, thought to study for 3 years and achieve complete enlightenment, but after 3 years, didn't quite get it, so it became another 3, became another 3, and became another 3. And so it became 12 years of continuous training, and at that time, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and so it became a little difficult for us Western people for a little bit, so I came west and started spending more time in the West. For the next 8 years, went to Dharamsala for about 6 months a year to do my meditations and training. I think these days you can get that same level of knowledge and experience much quicker, but in those days nobody knew Tibetan and nobody knew how to teach Westerners. If the old Tibetan tradition, they put you in a monastery when you were a monk or nun at age maybe 4 or 5, and then you kind of learned from then. So teaching to adults was a kind of a new thing. But for me, those years were very, very precious. I went on to start writing and translating books. I've done about perhaps 25 or 30 books on Himalayan spirituality, the art, literature, culture, history, and so forth. I kind of fell into the art side more by accident than by purpose. I lived across the street from the Dalai Lama's main artist, the artist who did most of the paintings for the Dalai Lama's temples and for the activities in India overseen by the Dalai Lama. I have a photograph of him later. So that's sort of where I came from. And well, in Buddhism, we're supposed to say when we achieved enlightenment. But as an Irishman, we're not allowed to do that, because Irish, we always lie. We always have to embellish the truth. So if I tell you I achieved enlightenment 10 years ago, really it was only yesterday or the week. If I say 50 years ago, it was only 30 years ago. So I won't say anything about my enlightenment. I wanted to start with this image. When I gave a talk last Tuesday, Harold, what was it, Thursday or Tuesday? Tuesday. I spoke about a friend of mine in New York, a Jewish man who 40 years ago was walking down the street in New York and came across a painting. And he was reasonably wealthy, but his business was going badly and his marriage was in trouble. He bought a painting. In fact, it was this painting. He hung it on his wall. And his business improved and his marriage improved. So he bought another painting, and again, things got better. And he went on to buy 2,000 or 3,000 more paintings. But I think this aspect of Buddhist art or spiritual art is something that's, I think in our secular society, we don't really appreciate as much as we should. You know, I've called this art exhibit Windows on Enlightenment, but a window really works both ways, doesn't it? We look out the window and we see something, but the window being open also brings something inside, doesn't it? Brings in fresh air and wonderful fragrances and all of the rest. The Tibetan word for an image is actually means the same as a vessel. So after a painting is done, essentially, it becomes an energy vessel from which we can drink the nectars of spiritual inspiration, enlightenment, transformation, and so forth. And I think I'm a big fan of a Russian-born New York artist called Nicholas Roerich, who back in the 1920s did many wonderful Buddhist pieces. During his life, he painted, I think, 7,000 pieces. In 1929, he became the first Buddhist to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Put another way, the first Buddhist to lose the nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't win, but he was nominated. And his Roerich Peace Pact, for which he was nominated, which was one of the reasons he was nominated, was signed by President Roosevelt 5 or 6 years later, and was a blueprint used by Eleanor Roosevelt in fashioning the International Declaration of Human Rights. But in that, he created the term Pax Cultura, peace through culture, peace through beauty. And he really borrowed that idea from the Buddhist tradition, this idea that sacred images bring peace to the heart, peace to the soul, peace to the mind, peace to the community. They also bring success, well-being, health, and so forth. And I mentioned that I saw a piece when I was 13, and this was the image. And when I saw this, I immediately thought, I could smile like that. 20 years of training, and I could smile like that. In the late 80s, I worked on a film with a New York filmmaker while I was living in Darmstadt at the time, called Mickey Lemley, and it was called Compassion in Exile, a movie on the Dalai Lama's life. And when I was in New York recently, speaking at one of the Buddhist centers there, he asked me to have dinner with him, and he mentioned that he had recently interviewed George Bush, W., who's not very popular in the Buddhist world because of various reasons. But the Dalai Lama had earlier on CNN had said that he was asked, who is the favorite human being you've met? Is it Mother Teresa, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Prince Charles, and he said George W. Bush, which shocked everyone. Many people say they think the Dalai Lama said that because George W. is the worst person he met, and therefore you have to be nicer to the worst person than to the nice person because they need it more. But Mickey told me he went down and he met with George W. to interview W. on why he had a special relationship to the Dalai Lama. And George Bush replied, well, when my daddy was president, I met with the Dalai Lama. And when I saw him, I had to look at his lips. I thought, those are real lips of compassion. I could have lips like that. I kind of like that story. And so W went on to say, from that time on, he made the quality of compassion a central issue in his spiritual life. I don't know how far it made it into his political life, but in his personal life. But for me, it was kind of the same. When I saw images of this Buddha figure, I saw that smile. I thought, my goodness, I would love to have that kind of smile, that kind of peace, serenity, wisdom, relaxed yet fully alert, like a samurai poised in the middle of battle, motionless in the middle of 10,000 activities. My favorite artist in the Tibetan world, Champala, who was the Dalai Lama's painter. In the Tibetan world, a master artist takes on apprentices. They usually study for 7 years without being able to do anything other than work on little pieces on the painting, like the flowers and the rocks and so forth, and eventually get a little more skillful and more skillful. Then by 7 years are sort of reasonably well trained, and after that do 5-year apprenticeship. So it's a 12-year training process, and for that reason, when we look at paintings like some of the ones here, we see such high levels of excellence. As we walk into our hall here, we have one of these, the 6 realms. And this is one from the Rubin Museum, which I used in one of my books called Buddha in Paradise. And I would have liked to have used some of the ones from our own exhibit here, but I would have had to break the glass to get inside and get photos of this quality. And I borrowed these art pieces for this exhibition from 5 different collectors, and they didn't want me to have high-quality photographs. They allowed the art to go, but not high-quality photographs in case I published them. And in fact, had they given to me, I would have published them. But this is a sort of a symbol of the Buddhist teaching in general. At the center, the 3 animals representing ignorance of nature of self, attachments, and anger. When we don't understand the nature of self, we don't understand the nature of others. When we don't understand the nature of self and others, then things which we develop a wrong sense of nature of self and a wrong sense of nature of others. Then things that support that wrong self develop generate attachment and dependence, and things which threaten that false self basically generate irritation, anger, fear, and so forth. Outside of that, on the right side, beings propelled by those 3 klesha are pulled down, and on the left side, inspired by goodness, are lifted up toward the light. Then the 6 realms, from the devas down to the hells and so forth, and the 12 links of dependent origination, beginning with ignorance. From ignorance comes a stamp on our mind which is distorted in every action. So the 12 links, the way they go, create suffering. The way they're reversed, bring liberation and enlightenment. The idea is something like that. Buddha, describing that first link, which is the most important, from ignorance to samskara, is that we should be like the bird in flight, leaving no footprint. In other words, when we have anger, attachment, or distorted sense of self, the energy left on the mind is a distorted energy. this then produces a distorted consciousness. The consciousness produces a distorted relationship with the world. Distorted relationship with the world produces all of the host of confusion, suffering, and unhappiness. Often in Indian Buddhism, they speak about Indian Buddhism having developed in 3 phases, or the Buddha having taught 3 phases. And in classical India, these were called Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So here, this is the sort of traditional way the Hinayana is portrayed, with the Vinaya and so forth. I do like the 2 flying monks on the side. I don't know if you can see them. And because of one of those flying in inappropriate times and places, the Buddha made the rule, no flying in inappropriate times and places. I use this image in my book, The Flying Mystics of Tibetan Buddhism, sort of a history of Buddhist levitation and flight. The story of why you shouldn't fly in inappropriate times and places is kind of cute. Moggallana was the flying disciple, and he often, because he could often demonstrate levitation and flying, and Venerable Dosang asked if I would demonstrate flying at the end of my lecture today, and I'm considering it still. But with Moggallana, he would often he'd go to give a teaching, and people would say, "Hey, stop talking, fly." And one time, the king and his men went out hunting, and Moggallana was invited to teach to the 500 queens, or the main queen and the 499 secondary queens. And the queens liked the talk very much, and at the end said, "Can we make an offering? And what can we offer?" And Moggallana said, "Oh, no need for anything. We have everything." They said, "Well, how about some food?" Moggallana says, "Well, your husband has given all the food we need." "Well, how about medicines? We don't have any sick people." "How about some cutlery and bowls?" "Oh, we have all we need. But there's one thing, we don't have enough clothing. We're ordaining some new monks, so we need some new clothing. So why don't you 500 ladies take off all of your clothes and put them on a pile on the side of the room, and I'll take them back and I'll accept them as an offering." So all 500 ladies took off their clothing. And at that moment, the king walked in with his bodyguards and was a little irritated, as husbands tend to be in such circumstances. So he sent his men catch that monk and cut off his head. So Moggallana levitated into the air and sang down songs to the king. Now, don't be jealous. That's just clothing that we're going to dye and make into monk's robes. So the king was irritated that he couldn't cut off Moggallana's head. So he went to the Buddha and complained. And Buddha made the rule, monks should not fly in inappropriate times and places. So the painting is often used to represent the Hinayana Buddha as a monk with 2 monk disciples. This is often used to represent Mahayana. The Buddha holds up a white lotus and teaches. Now, he was asked to give what is the ultimate reality, and he just held up a lotus and said nothing. And Mahakashyapa got the meaning and achieved enlightenment on the spot, and the others still needed a little bit of further, deeper, more articulated guidance. So he went on to speak the 42 Prajnaparamita Sutras, including the Diamond Sutra, which I think is over here, right? This is the Diamond Sutra written above. And so this is often used to represent the Mahayana teaching. The Diamond Sutra, and the main difference here is the idea that in the Mahayana is that our practice has to extend to embrace all living beings. And finally, Tantrayana, which is often represented, or Vajrayana, represented by Buddha and the 84 Arhats. So sort of rather than only the monastic, or the emphasis on monastic living, the emphasis on solitary meditation, usually in mountains, forests, and charnel grounds. This is one I also used in my book, Flying Mystics, with the great 11th, 10th century master Naropa, Tilopa, and so forth, whose lineages became so important in Tibet. Then Buddha and the 16 arhants. And over here we have a thing of the 500 arhants. These 16 are sort of special amongst those 500. And these sort of combine, if you will, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, all three come into that. Because those 16 were asked to extend their powers of immortality and stay until Maitreya Buddha manifests and the golden age is ushered in. And so each of those 16 is sitting in the center of a mountain somewhere on the planet, maybe one of these mountains, one of them. And whenever they need anything, and whenever they need to do something to help the world in little ways, they send an emanation. So I'm sure that, one of you here is an emanation of one of those 16 sent to check to see that I don't make any mistakes in my presentation today. This Amitabha, and we have two Amitabha paintings, one on the screen on the left and one right behind me. I used this as the cover of the book, a book I did on Buddhist art for the Rubin Museum in New York called Buddha in Paradise. But this represents, if you will, the quintessence of the Mahayana or the Universalist doctrine, how the light of enlightenment is omnipresent. Wherever you go, it's never far. And he sits in a pure land, Sukhavati. In the same way, we are always in a paradise if we learn to look with eyes that can see the paradise quality. And I think, after China invaded Tibet, they destroyed the 6,500 monasteries and either killed or imprisoned the hundreds of thousands of monks. And about 1,000 of those survived the 23-year imprisonment. Then at the end of that, there was liberalization brought in by Deng Xiaoping. They were released. And the first one I met, I said, how was it 23 years in a Chinese communist prison? It must have been pretty tough. He said, oh, it was great. We could meditate all day. They just locked us in our cell and we could meditate all day. He said once a day they'd give us a little bit of a beating. That was inconvenient, but not so bad. But in that way, this Mahayana idea symbolized by Amitabha, that paradise, the quality of enlightenment is always something with us. It's just kind of we don't notice it. We put our attention on something else drags our sort of the coarse aspect of our mind, the coarse aspect of our awareness somewhere else. If we learn to retune to that boundless radiance, then we'll notice we are always in it. We'll notice also that the world is always totally an emanation of that boundless radiance. That the lack of boundless radiance in the universe is really more due to interpretation and the way we tie our own selves up in knots. Mahayana often talks about the three great bodhisattvas, Manjusri, Avalokiteshvara, and Vajrapani. We've got a couple of Vajrapanis. This is Manjusri, and this are the three, Rigsum Gampo. And if our new paintings from Nepal over there, we have two in the upper corners, two sets of these three. But how do we achieve enlightenment? We essentially do it by these three qualities. Manjusri, who holds a lotus with the wisdom teaching. So firstly, we have to we have to get the instruction on enlightenment, and he holds the sword. We have to be able to bring that instruction, that practice, directly to the point. And so the sword, it says, cuts out the root of ignorance. If we don't understand nature of self, we cut out the root of not understanding nature of self. What arises? Understanding of nature of self. The meaning is something like that. Usually they're shown as sitting on a lotus. A lotus grows in mud but is not stained by mud. If you have a lotus pool, it's usually in the bottom of a garden. And all the things that die on the land, like the insects and the animals' poo-poo and so on, and it rains, and that all goes into the pool at the bottom. And all of that transforms and comes out perfectly beautiful lotus. In that same way, if we have that quality of wisdom of ultimate reality and conventional reality, no matter what we do or where we go, we always remain as pure and perfect as the lotus. And ultimate reality, conventional reality, kind of big topics in the Buddhist world. Conventional reality means the things the way we experience them. Ultimate reality means what is beyond that. For instance, we always experience things in a limited way, but everything's limitless. We experience things in a duality way. That is to say, I see you by taking away the rest of the universe. There's you, the rest of the universe. That gives me the sense that there's a you and the rest of the universe. But in reality, it's not like that, is it? You and the rest of the universe are part of the same thread on a one fabric. There's no place that you start and the universe ends, or the universe, you end and the universe starts. This is purely a trick of the mind. So ultimate reality is talking about when we take away that mental trick and we see things interconnected to the whole universe. So the sword and up on top, on our left, Manjusri's right, the Buddha of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, in China, Kuan Yin, in I think Japan, Konan, and also pronounced how in Korean? Kwangsum. Yeah, I was close. I'm not going to try it again. And top right, Vajrapani. So wisdom, compassion, and power. These are the three things we need for enlightenment. Power here doesn't mean power over someone else or over something else. It doesn't mean mind over matter. It means as long as we are driven by ignorance, attachment, irritation, anger, and the mind of duality, we are never free. We're always under the power of some other force. The meaning is that. And when the more free we become from anger, the more free we become from attachment, the more power, personal power, the more freedom we have. And it comes down to ignorance of nature of self, of course. The more we are free from misunderstanding nature of self, relationship between mind and matter, relationship between me and the world, who I am, what is the world, the more true that becomes, the freer I become. The freer I become, the more powerful I become, the more self-empowered. I wanted to show this Vajrapani because Mongolia especially loves Vajrapani, and they make this 200-meter tall one. And every Tibetan monastery made similar images of their favorite that they would hang once a year to remind everyone, hey, like in Mongolia, cherish your freedom, cherish your self-power, cherish your self-ability. And we have a Vajrapani statue where, oh, right here behind me. He holds up the 5-point Vajra, which means everything we see, smell, taste, touch, and hear, we experience it as mirror-like awareness. In other words, when I see something, what I see is something within me, and therefore there's something about me in what I'm seeing. The same with all the other, and with feelings, usually I like, I don't care. The ability to have that arise as having respect for all things, regardless of whether you like them or don't like them. Bed bugs, mosquitoes, you may like them or don't like them. Their moms think they're very nice little things. Like a lady bed bug walking around meets a boy bed bug, and they think, oh, what a nice little creature. Let's make some more of us nice little creatures. So naturally, we have likes and dislikes which are personified, which we have karmically. But in liberation, freedom means noticing that these are just contextual; they're nothing ultimate. I want to do a little bit extra on the Buddha of compassion and the 4 arms, and we have a 4-armed Avalokiteshvara statue over there from Manchu, Mongolia. But these 4 arms is the most popular form throughout Central Asia, and the 4 hands being love, universal compassion, universal joy, and equanimity. A mind that equally loves, compassions, and rejoices for people who are nice to you, people who are not nice to you, and people who are in between. And this is considered to be the essence of Mahayana training, that without this there is no Mahayana. Everyone can like their own kids or the kids of their friends. They like their own friends, they like their own family. Mahayana means universal. So learning to have love for all living beings, regardless of whether they seem nice or unnice. And having compassion for all beings, and rejoicing in the goodness or success of all living beings. And finally, equanimity. That rejoicing bit in Tibetan Buddhist is considered very, very important, because we see so many beautiful things in the world all the time. Like if I come here, the beautiful forests and the valleys and the wonderful buildings, which I heard have won an architectural award. Wonderful people. And if I could, on the one hand, become jealous and say, oh, I wish I had something like this. This makes me feel unhappy that I don't have something like this. And we see someone who is more famous than us, we can have that. Someone more beautiful than us, we can have that. Someone with a bit more beautiful house or car or whatever. We can feel down about it, or we can feel up about it. So in Mahayana, learning to notice the greatness of the blessings of all living beings, and then noticing that within oneself, one has equal blessings and greatnesses, and to take joy in those at all times. Buddha said Dharma should be fun in the beginning, fun in the middle, and fun in the end. Joyful in the beginning, joyful in the middle, and joyful in the end. So this is one of the 4 pillars, you could say. I wanted to include this one just for the Koreans. Recently I was teaching in Russia, and in the Hermitage, which has one of the greatest collections of Silk Road art in the world. And I'm always very impressed by the very unique look of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion in Korea, and his little mustache. Whenever you go in any Korean temple, from Jeju Island all the way up to the borders of China, all of the Shenrezis have this very nice little mustache. And you don't see that in Tibet much, or in China, and so on. So I wondered, iconographically, what's the connection? And this is a 10th century piece from Turfan, which is way presently under Russian administration, but it's basically just north of Persia on the Silk Road, and a very great Buddhist kingdom in the old days. So Buddhism came up from India through Pakistan, hit Afghanistan and pulled a right, and then went over to a great kingdom called Khotan, or Hotan, and spread north to Turfan. And from there spread over throughout the Mongol territories and down through China and over through Korea. So this is the earliest Buddha of compassion with a mustache. And because every temple in Korea has that, I thought this would be especially interesting for the Korean members here, and also any of you here who happen to have a mustache. And in Mahayana, then, the Enlightenment energy pervades everywhere, like Tara with all these millions of little Taras. So Enlightenment energy is considered to be a sort of a female quality, and women are wisdom. The healing Buddhas, and we have 2 healing Buddha mandalas, I think. We have Amitayas over there, and an older Amitayas up here. And I used this on the cover of a book I did called The Female Buddhas, which I did for the Rubin Museum. And these are on the top 2 corners, and the central corner. Those are known as Sering La Sum, the 3 healing Buddhas in Tibetan Buddhist world. And everyone does one of those 3 practices once a month. So what does it mean to practice healing? So Dosung La had requested I say a little bit about how these are used for meditation. If we take the central one, female Buddhas, the female Buddha Tara, we begin our meditation with the standard Sangyachura, refuge, bodhicitta, I'll achieve enlightenment quickly to benefit all beings. And then well, I'll practice by means of 6 perfections, I'll become a great living Buddha quickly. Then we do the 4 immeasurables, may all beings have happiness, cause of happiness. So love, compassion, joy, equanimity. Om Sobo Vaishodo Sabba Dhamma Sobo Vaishodo Hum. Everything goes into emptiness. All things are pure since the beginning in the nature of ultimate reality. Only contextually in particular situations are they designated as pure or impure. Then we come out of emptiness as the female Buddha. Out of emptiness, my ordinary body has disappeared, the world has disappeared. I reappear as the female Buddha. And my body is a 16-year-old vibrant body, and my heart is a ring of mantras. And as I do those mantras, I send out lights and fill my body with radiance. First, I fill it with a yellow radiance, and all of the earth elements are completely healed. And then I fill it with white radiance, and all of the water elements completely healed, red radiance, all the fire elements, green radiance, all of the air elements, blue radiance, the balance of all the 5 elements, and so forth. In this way, by means of power of radiance and emanation, I perform a kind of a inner Reiki style readjustment. Of interest, I think about 5 years ago, I was traveling through Florida, and the daughter of a very famous senator brought me her best friend who was given 3 weeks to live with cancer. And she just came really for instruction on how to die happily, and she was about to check into a hospice. So I took out my dice and I did a divination. And I said, so you don't actually have to die for another 4 or 5 years if you don't want to. So if you do some meditation practice and just get away from the doctors you're attending, and anyway they've given up on you, then come with me to Nepal. We'll put you on a decent doctor with proper traditional medicines, Ayurvedic and Buddhist traditional medicines, and take you meditating in the caves of Tibet at 15 to 18,000 feet, and you'll have another 4 or 5 years. And so we went over. She only bought a one-way ticket because she wasn't convinced. And so she gave away her house and gave all her money to her son and put all her stuff in a storage unit, in a shipping unit to be shipped to her son. When he got the news, she had died. All her friends phoned me up and said, Lama Glenn, this is terrible to do that, because she had cancer of the fat tissue between the heart and the abdomen. And so it was pushing way down and pushing out, and it had become about 15 or 16 pounds. And they couldn't operate on it because they could cut the heart vessel. And the heart vessel had become too weak. So they said, and she'd had earlier from a car accident to reconstructive surgery on the tummy. So they said, you're going to be in a temple in Tibet, and she's going to like break open, and all of her insides will fall on the temple floor. And I said, well, you know, in Buddhism we don't mind blood and guts that much. Everyone here has blood and guts. If she's going to turn inside out somewhere, it's just as good in a temple as somewhere else. And so it's up to her if she wants to. So she came, and she did this practice. And when we came out of Tibet 3 weeks later, her tumor had gone from 15 to 16 pounds down to the size of a marble. So it had gone from the size of almost a basketball, well, say a soccer ball, between a grapefruit and a soccer ball, and down to the size of a marble. Then she was very upset because she said, oh, dang, I'm not going to die, but I've given all my money away. So this is Amitayas, which is considered the source of all of the healing by means of meditation and yoga. Is especially important for what's known as the 8 generation stage and 8 completion stage yogas. For the completion stage, one takes a deep breath, presses down and pulls up on the abdominal floor, makes your tummy into like a basketball, and then twists your tummy 3 times this way, 3 times this way, and then pulls the energy all the way up the center of the body and dispels. I wanted to include this one in Tantra because sometimes in Tantra the image of enlightenment are shown as male-female in union like this. The idea is that for us to achieve enlightenment, we have to draw all of the strength from all of our female ancestors and from all of our male ancestors. If we can bring those 72,000 genetic impulses from our female ancestors and 72,000 from our male ancestors into perfect harmony and bring them through the 5 chakras, then we achieve enlightenment on the spot. Therefore, it's known as Guhya Samaja in Sanskrit, or Sangwe Dupa in Tibetan, meaning the secret gathering, by gathering the forces of your male and female ancestors within yourself. I wanted to show just a few pieces on how the art is also used as kind of a cultural, if you will, importance of cultural attunation. Remembering the good things about one's history. These are the great three kings who, in the center, a previous incarnation of the Dalai Lama, it said, Sangsen Gampo, basically made Tibet, created the Tibetan Empire the way it came down until 1950s when communism invaded. He united all of the 400 kingdoms of Central Asia and spread all the way up to Mongolia, down into Nepal, into the southern Himalayas, west to Ladakh, and so forth. And so he also at that time had this fellow here this is a Mongolian piece, go to India and create a script that would be used from that time until today. And so that script, and those of you who are interested, I've put a couple of books in front of the stupa with some of that old Tibetan script created in about 630 or 640. And it's endured until today as a Tibetan phonetic script. In 792, the Chinese script was banned from Tibet, and translation from Chinese and so forth was all banned. And everything had to come from India or Nepal, Kashmir, from the Buddhist kingdoms to the south and west. And Tibetan script became the official script based on Sanskrit. I put up this piece because in the museum in Mongolia, he's wrongly identified as this guy. Kublai Khan basically invaded and created China the way we know it today. Prior to that, China had never been one country. So he basically created the China as it exists today, a Mongolian king. And he made Buddhism the national religion of all of the Mongols, and it remains as such until today. He also had the Tibetan script adopted for use throughout the spiritual aspects of his empire. In other words, all monasteries and temples had to learn Tibetan and do all the rituals in Tibetan and read and write in Tibetan. He planned to ban Chinese, a script altogether, but the Black Plague struck 150 years later and ended the Mongol Empire. So as a result, Chinese today still write with that 5,000 characters to say pass the salt, rather than 30 characters in a phonetic alphabet. It doesn't take 5,000 to say pass the salt, but if you want to add anything to it, like pass it quickly, please, or I'll get angry. And so this is Chogyal Pakpa, the Lama, the guru of the Kublai Khan, who basically invaded, conquered China and united it, also forged an alliance with Korea. Now, some people say conquered Korea, conquered Tibet. In fact, there was very little conquering required. That's mostly retroactively written. Of course, there were a few battles here and there, but Kublai Khan, the Mongols considered the Koreans, the Mongols, and the Tibetans to be one people. And therefore, they always had a very special relationship with the Mongols, as opposed to China, which was a conquered nation. Those three, in case you don't know, people born in Tibet, in Mongolia, and in Korea, and those Japanese who are descended from Koreans are born with a blue spot on their bottom. So that's sort of the sign of being sort of a pure-blood Mongolian, Korean, or Tibetan. And usually it disappears when you're 2 or 3 years old, so it's no point asking the Koreans here to show us their blue spot. And later, in about 1580, the third Dalai Lama, was invited to travel and teach to the Mongol areas. And this is basically from that time on, all of the Mongol areas became Dalai Lama's school. They liked him so much. I really love the poem he wrote the night of his death. He died in the Mongol regions, and he announced in the morning he'd be passing away that night, and he called all his students into the temple, and he wrote a poem for them and read it out, and then they all sat in meditation, and while he was in meditation, he passed away. But the poem said, "Though I have traveled and taught for the last 40, 50 years, in fact, I have never moved from the clear light of being. And therefore, I've never felt even the slightest fatigue." And so in that same way, if we can learn to rest the mind in the natural radiance of being, no matter how hard you work, you never move one hair from enlightenment, or you never move one hair from Buddha nature. I wanted to include this because one of the biggest collectors of Tibetan art in the world is the Han family in Korea, and they built a building somewhat like the Rubin Museum in New York, which also hosts 1,000 or two. Then the Lama King. This one I wanted to show because we have a couple of Padmasambhavas here. We have the painting over on the far left and the statue where, I think, also over there, yeah. No, the statue is behind the screen in front of the... I wanted to show this because also art is kind of reconciliation, I thought is important. And here, a very eccentric mystic in Mongolia, the fifth incarnation of the Noyon Hotukt, known as the Lama of the Gobi. He was sort of like a Dalai Lama. Tibetan Mongolia was a federation of about 400 kingdoms, each of whom had a lama, a reincarnate lama like the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was kind of special amongst equals, you could say. But each of those was sort of incarnate lama of that region, and each of those regions also had a king. So they had those two, the king to take care of secular well-being, and the lama, the reincarnate lama, to see to the spiritual stability and health of the region. But he was very eccentric. He wrote about 1,000 or so poems, wrote and staged 12 operas and took them on the road, built a dozen meditation centers and monasteries and so forth. But during his lifetime, two travelers, Manchus traveling through his territory, were assassinated by bandits and stabbed to death. So he gathered one knife from each of the households under his spiritual guidance, if you will, and 10,000 households gave him their knives. And he melted the knives down and made this image of Padmasambhava. So it's known as the statue of 10,000 knives. And I think when we look at art pieces, it's unfortunate, when China invaded Tibet, they destroyed the 6,500 monasteries and the libraries that went with them. And some of the art was carried out or saved by brave people. Some was hidden in caves or buried and later retrieved. Some was basically soldiers just would take 10 or 20 paintings or statues and ship them home to China and later sell them on the black market or on the antique market down in Hong Kong. But what's really unfortunate is the story of each piece was told in a book known as a Karcha, a Gompa Karcha, the monastery catalog. So every work of art and mention the name of the artist and who had patronized it, what was the story with it. And the real sadness of the destruction of so much so quickly by the communists was those storybooks have been lost. So for instance, over here where we have a 16th century Amitayas mandala, that will have a very fascinating story with it. Or the Guru Rinpoche, or any of the other pieces we have here. But although those paintings were saved, the catalog with the monastic record with the story of their creation, who created them, who patronized them, what was the particular situation. Very often it was something like this. Someone was murdered, and as an act of making everyone feel a little bit better. Now everyone, Buddhists don't like to kill people in general, and the travelers were even less. It's okay, if your neighbor and you had a serious fight, then maybe it's understandable. But just like some guy traveling through your land, you murder him, it makes everyone feel bad. And so for reconciliation, building a peace like this was considered a way of making everyone feel better about themselves. Slightly guilty for the murder, but at the same time, relieved of any guilt or released through this act of contrition. I wanted to include this 11th century female mystic just because in Tibet there was a tradition of naked meditators. And Tibet was quite cold, but Machik Lubden lived to 99 years of age and always was naked, even in the middle of winter at like 30 below zero, and by the power of her meditation kept warm. And she refused to wear clothes. She's supposed to be very, very beautiful, but she said, I have no intellectual obscurations or prejudices, so I don't need to wear clothes. In today's world, we'll probably throw her in a mental hospital and make her wear clothes. But she achieved enlightenment at about age 20, and then lived till she was 99. I wanted to show this piece because I wish I could have brought it to hang up above the wall right here. It's about the same size as the 100 Arhants. It's a part of a set of 5 of the 35 Buddhas of purification. And to conclude, the Shambhala, the prophecy of a golden age. And this is very strong in Kalachakra Tantra. And according to that prophecy, we kind of come into a tight situation in the world. And then following the tight situation, we either have 1,000 years of golden light or 1,000 years of darkness. And according to the prophecy, we're sort of coming to that era and in the next generations. And therefore, the Dalai Lama often gives this initiation, Kalachakra. He gave it in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago to like 20,000 people, I think. He's given it in India. The first time I went to it was 350,000 people. According to the idea, if everyone on the planet of people of good conscience generate lots of positive energy and good karma, then we get 1,000 years of light. And if people get lackadaisical, lazy, and apathetic, then 1,000 years of darkness. And I think we can see how that easily could happen in today's world. Wanted to conclude with 2 photos of the Dalai Lama. 1995, I was asked to bring a Dalai Lama exhibit to Atlanta of his personal objects to show at the Olympic, in honor of the Summer Olympics. So this is 1996, we opened in a museum there. And so we had about 40 pieces of art from Dalai Lama's private sacred possessions, you could say, and some others related to him. And when he arrived, I get in a lot of trouble for this photograph because it looks like he's bowing to me. But I kind of like that. What happened was his assistant, his organizer, phoned me from New York and mentioned a problem they were having. And I said, well, I gave my advice. And my advice was a little bit critical of the Tibetan government, actually. And so obviously they gave that to the Dalai Lama. So when he arrived, he came up and he looked at me and he said, very mischievous, and he started laughing. And then when he laughed, he started going down, and I was laughing and going down, and he was laughing and going down, and I was laughing and going down. And I was trying to stay lower than him, because in the Tibetan world, you always try to keep your head lower than the High Lama. It's just kind of a tradition. So I was trying, but that's when he ducked down way down below me, and someone snapped the picture right at that time. And after that, there was no more picture of me with my head lower than his. So I put this on my Facebook page, and all the Tibetans and many of the traditional Buddhists around the world got very angry at me and said, Glenn, even if you have a picture of the Dalai Lama bowing lower than you, you should never show it in public. So now I show it wherever I go. So I'll finish there. And, if anyone has anything they like to talk about, Venerable Dosunla said I should leave some time at the end for some discussion. Anyone has any questions or points to make? Because I know everything about everything. Being Irish, you can ask about anything from finance to private romantic matters to Buddhist art to meditation to international travel to numbers of lottery tickets. Yes.
Why make paintings? Is it to teach?
I think, I've called this windows to enlightenment. And I think it works both ways, as I said. One is when you look at a painting, you're looking into enlightenment. But in another way, something about the painting is looking back at you. And so, in a way, a great work of art is a two-way tunnel. It's you looking into it, and it's speaking to you. And in the Buddhist world, I mentioned this in my Tuesday talk, that sometimes with great works of art, we can actually hear them say things in words. If you meditate in front of them with a question, you'll often hear an answer. So it's not only the beauty, and as I mentioned, I do like Nicholas Roerch's idea, peace through culture, peace through beauty. But I think Buddhist art goes a little further than that, as do many pieces of sacred art. And this isn't only Buddhist art, but I'm only an expert on Buddhist art. So as I mentioned, the name for Buddhist art in Tibetan is ten, which means a vessel, which means it has a kind of a living energy that you can drink, a nectar that you can drink. And in drinking that nectar, you can have many wonderful results. So it's not just I think we have this idea, and they were starting with Descartes, and where mind and body become enemies. The government and Descartes decided the state should be in charge of the body and the church in charge of the mind. And body and mind went separate ways. But in the West before that, there wasn't such a strong idea that body and mind were separate entities. Like, for instance, when I see you, how do you experience me? I arise as an image within your mind. In other words, I'm right at the very core of your soul when you look at me. And when I look at you, the same thing. There is no place in your mind where I begin and you end, and vice versa. So this idea that somehow matter is this dead, static substance floating around, and we are like a little bubble island walking, and everything that happens outside this bubble is something different, isn't there in Buddhism. The big term, especially in Mahayana, is non-duality, ni-me, the non-inseparability of the things we experience from our own mind as the experiencer. There's a very interesting outcome of some of Einstein's work who is a kind of a closet Buddhist. He said that if he were to be one spiritual tradition, the only tradition that was in harmony with his view of the world was Buddhism. And one offspin of his work is that what is a particle of matter? We think these particles of matter are moving in very particular ways and places, but in fact, they are at random places depending upon the perceiver. In other words, that particle of matter isn't really right here where we think it is. We just take a flash on it, and it becomes there for us, that particle of matter. And in other words, the whole world as we experience it does not exist even slightly the way it appears. We are like photoshopping the world at all times with our own inner brush. And so a painting, when we look at a painting, firstly, the artist makes it. Secondly, masters, we take it to our favorite lama or our favorite master, and he throws rice or flowers on it and says, all of the enlightenment forces of all the 10 directions come into this peace right now, pung. And until all living beings achieve enlightenment, abide, leave your energies right in this peace. In other words, it's blessed or consecrated or empowered. So before Nagarjuna decided to do something, for instance, he went to a statue of Tara at the great Mahabodhi temple and meditated in front of it. And then the statue spoke to him. I don't think the stone mouth moved, but as he sat meditating, he had a vision of Buddha, the female Buddha Tara, answering his question. And before Atisha went to Tibet, he meditated in front of the same image. I have another, just very modern friend. About 30 years ago, there's a very famous statue of Vajrayogini, the female Buddha Vajrayogini in Nepal. And she was thinking of sort of giving up ordinary life and becoming a nun and taking over a monastery. And so when she went to her favorite temple and meditated, and suddenly the Vajrayogini, some tears started to stream down the eye. And it was like a dry day. It's a metal statue, not a stone statue. And for her, that was a very clear sign that it was a nice thing. I mean, it looked kind of like joyful tears, not like, oh, boo-hoo, you're becoming a nun. It's like, hey, that would be good for you. Tears of joy. So I think this idea that sacred images are not just clay or a piece of iron or bronze or something like that. Yes, in this chair. Say that again?
Is there a difference in how we experience
I would say that not historically in terms of the idea of them as vessels of spiritual energy or conduits of spiritual energy. But personally, I'm a big fan of painting and I don't much care for sculpture. I think it's to do with sort of karmic, one's own personal sort of predispositions. As I mentioned in the beginning, this Borobudur, these statues at Borobudur were the first Buddhist art I really saw that really knocked my socks off, and I was, I don't know, 10 or 11, 12, something like that. So for me, I think my great inspiration in Buddhist art began with the statues, but I hadn't seen some of the paintings, and especially was known, there's a Mentri and New Mentri, the New Mentri school of art that began in Tibet about 1600 and continued to about 1750. It brought together all the best elements of the Silk Road. And so for me, that's the highest form that painted art has achieved. And the piece where the Amityas we have here is in that New Mentri style. And for that reason, it's my favorite piece in this particular exhibition. But in terms of what is most powerful in terms of sort of resonating with an individual, I think that's something very personal. For me, it was these Borobudur statues. I really love the Burmese art as well, very, very much. It's very similar to Tibetan art. And Tibetan language is often called an Indo-Burmese language group. The early Tibetans came from the borders of Burma and spread north. The idea is something like that. So in ancient times, the trade routes went down through Burma. I wanted to go down that way about just before the Tiananmen Square thing happened. And it was very hard to get a permit from China to go, but I've been to Tibet half a dozen times and I'd hoped to get in. Then Tiananmen Square happened and all permits were cancelled, and all Tibet was and most of China put under martial law, so I didn't get down there. But some of the art coming out of there which sort of blends Tibetan and Burmese Buddhist traditions, are very, very amazing. Yes.
How would you answer what I heard often say? Buddhism is wonderful, but it's really a philosophy because it doesn't believe in God.
You know, God is, in Buddhism we have this idea of the limitation of words. So if we say emptiness, Nagarjuna mentions 8 qualities to emptiness. One is when you say emptiness, you don't experience ultimate reality. In the same way, when you say God, you don't immediately have an experience of God. So I think historically, when Buddha came along in India, one problem they had was people tended to be personally irresponsible and to either blame God for bad things or credit God with good things, and not put enough attention on their own actions. So Buddha tried, I think, to present a path to freedom, spirituality, transformation that wouldn't have to that would rely on a more personal kind of linguistic structure rather than a devotional structure. As Buddha put it, you are your own savior or you are your own condemner. If you live well, study, meditate, practice, develop your own wisdom, compassion, and power, you become your own savior. If you don't, and you just spin on the wheel of ignorance, anger, and attachments, bad habits, then your own condemner. So I think we should understand it within that light. The God issue doesn't come up as a point of discussion in many Buddhist sutras. And you could say that within Mahayana Buddhism, this idea of Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, the 3 dimensions of enlightenment, the formless, and the Sambhogakaya, the beatific, and the Nirmanakaya in the world. You know, there's a kind of an idea that Christianity borrowed that trinity from Buddhism to have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, because there was no trinity in Judaism before Christ. And so that trinity is there in Buddhism. And, Buddhism had been very much in contact with the Middle East for almost 300 years by the time of Christ. So certainly Buddhist caravans were traveling from India, Buddhist India, to Alexandria. They were stopping in Philistine, which is Beirut, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. There's no question of that. So I think the Christian idea of the Trinity very possibly could be informed by or inspired by the Buddhist idea of the 3 dimensions of enlightenment life or sacred life. God the Dharmakaya as God the Father works quite well. Sambhogakaya as the Holy Spirit, and Nirmanakaya as God the Son. When you achieve enlightenment, your mind goes to the Godhead. Your feelings and your emotions go through the beatific saintly levels. And still you emanate in the world. You get up in the morning and go to work and do whatever you do. Pay your taxes and vote for Donald Trump or whoever. So thank you very much. And again, I very much like to thank the One Buddhist Center for inviting me and asking me to create some kind of a Tibetan art exhibit here. And it's a very great honor to be here when His Holiness is visiting, who's a very rare occasion and very wonderful opportunity for all of you guys, but a very great honor for me to be here when he's in the vicinity. So thank you so much.